I'm concerned. There was a report that came out from the Brennan Center that essentially, for those of us who are doing voting rights and voter protection work, we have reason to be concerned about what has happened as a result of this weakened Voting Rights Act. Unpack for us what this study found and what we need to do about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we took a new look at the racial turnout gap, so the disparity in turnout rates between white Americans and voters of color. It's something political scientists have studied for a long time, but we got our hands on some really, really good data. The voter file, we've got data on about 1 billion different votes that were cast over the last 16 years, and we're able to use those to actually really get a fine-grained estimate of how big the racial turnout gap is, not relying on surveys, but actually data directly from the government on how big this racial turnout gap is. And what we show is that over the last 16 years, the turnout gap has grown immensely. It's grown immensely all around the country for all voters except for Asian American voters. Their gap has gotten a little bit smaller. But it's costing millions of votes. By the 2020 election, we estimate that about 9 million more votes would have been cast by voters of color if the turnout gap were closed. And especially worse, coming out of your guys' conversation about the 1960 Civil Rights Act, we find that the places that used to be covered by a really strong Voting Rights Act, they had what was called the pre-clearance regime, so they had to get permission to change their policies, that the gap is exploding there, that it's actually growing about twice as quickly in those parts of the country as it would be if the strong Voting Rights Act were still in effect.
Now, Dr. Morris, I'm going to have to pretend to fake clutch my pearls and feign surprise. I am shocked, I say, to learn that the very places that were subjected to a pre-clearance provision of the previously strengthened Voting Rights Act, and the pre-clearance provision on this show, we well know, is that provision that said if you have a history of being a bad actor when it comes to the racial distribution of access to the ballot, meaning, are you discriminated against people for race or by their race or for their race, and when it comes to the vote, that you would have to get the government to sign off. They would have to pre-clear any changes that you wanted to make to your voting apparatus, if you wanted to move poll sites, if you wanted to change the dates, your redistricting maps, all of these things had to be pre-cleared because, similar to the Congress that was in place in 1875, when they passed the 1875 Civil Rights Act, they knew that, listen, people in our demographic who have a bad history of discriminating are probably going to keep discriminating. And so I'm going to pretend to be shocked, Dr. Morris, that the very places where we had histories of voter suppression, now that we no longer have the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act, are once again bedrocks of voter suppression. Should I be surprised? Were you surprised by any of that?
I was surprised at how big the effects were. I expected,
Wow.
that like this had an impact for sure. We knew
Yeah,
out of 2013 that it was a bad Supreme Court decision,
right.
and in 2013 Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote, getting rid of this is like throwing away your umbrella because you're not getting wet in a rainstorm, right? So
That's
we
right.
knew that the turnout gap had closed in these places with Obama at the top of the ballot in 2008 and 2012.
Mm,
But what a lot of observers said back then, and it sounds like you were one of them, was you know that one of the reasons that things have gotten better is precisely because of the Voting Rights Act. So we're
right.
throwing away a tool that was actually very effective. So I can't say I'm shocked that places that were trying to do racism before continued to have growing disparities in the racial turnout gap when we got rid of the pre-clearance condition.
But let's talk about what did surprise you, though, which was how big the gap is. Break down some of these numbers for us, if you could.
Yeah, so we kind of use some very fancy statistical techniques that are too boring to get into on the show this morning, but we're able to come up with a model of what we think the world would have looked like if Shelby County had not been handed down, if there was still the pre-clearance condition, and we compare that model of what the world would have looked like to what actually happened. So we
Hmm.
think the turnout gap grew everywhere, all around the country, even in places that weren't covered. So, we think that it probably would have grown in those places, even if Section 5, even if the pre-clearance regime stayed in place. But what we show is that it grew twice as quickly as we would have expected otherwise. So by
Wow.
2022, we estimate that the Shelby County effect was costing hundreds of thousands of votes from voters of color. That
Wow.
one Supreme Court decision was disenfranchising hundreds of thousands of voters. And that's an enormous number.
You're giving me more reason to hold my nose at the notion of the Supreme Court. I'm so angry about them right now. Like, just so much injustice being allowed in this moment. Give us a sense as to what the real world impact of that. If this racial turnout gap is almost grew as twice as quickly in formerly covered jurisdictions, what were some of the do we know what some of those key jurisdictions were? Were there some significant cases, or rather some significant elections that perhaps might have gone another way? Are there policies that might have been implemented that perhaps were not because of the turnout gap? What's the lived impact and experience as a result of the Supreme Court's weakening the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that's it's hard to know whether any individual election went a different way because of this. But what we do know is that more than 60 statewide races have been decided by 5 percentage points or fewer since Shelby County was handed
Wow.
down. And so there are a lot of elections where both candidates and policies supported by voters of color and candidates supported not by voters of color won, right? So it's not always necessarily pointing in the same direction. But we do know that there's a huge number of elections that are decided by pretty thin margins, especially in these formerly covered places.
Right.
One of the examples that I always give, right, is the same day that Shelby County was handed down by the Supreme Court, Texas reenacted their voter suppression law, their voter ID bill that had been blocked under pre-clearance 2 years earlier. So the federal government in 2011 said, you can't do this because this is going to have racially discriminatory outcomes. And so it was blocked from going into effect. And then 2 years later, they put the exact same policy into effect. And it takes a number of years in court to finally get it struck down. But
I got to be honest with you. When that happened, I was like, see, that's exactly what we were talking about. Y'all, literally, Texas had gotten their pre-clearance application denied. The federal government was like, nah, son, like, these are going to be terrible. Like, it's going to be awful. You can't do this thing. Shelby County comes down, that decision, which gutted the pre-clearance provision. And Texas is like, hold my beer. And they just came right on in with the very same issues that had been prevented because they were going to be harmful to Black and brown voters. And they were able to implement it. And they were able to do that because of how the Supreme Court ruled in that decision. This, to me, when that happened, I was like, can somebody send them? Did they see this article? Did they see the report? I don't think they cared, though. It was just me. It's just me waxing poetic. Now, you said something earlier that I wanted to come back to. You said that the gap has increased for all groups except Asian Americans. What's happening within the Asian American community that allowed them to evade this particular harmful outcome?
yeah, it's a really interesting question that I don't have a great answer to at this point. It's something that we're continuing to look into. We do know that, as immigrant groups live in the United States for longer, they tend to start turning out at higher rates. So this might be the children of immigrants that are feeling more plugged into the American political system, that maybe are coming up through our great public schools and hearing that, voting is a big part of being American. So there are some other kind of macro level trends that might be influencing that. It is definitely, it's a good thing. It's something that we should be studying more to learn more from. How do we bring more non-white Americans, voters of color, into the system? But it's something that I don't, unfortunately, have a super satisfying answer to right now.
I'm curious about that because one of the things that we've seen is that the Asian population growth, along with Latino population growth, is really driving population increase in the places where we have population increase. A lot of Black communities are staying stagnant or increasing at slightly slower rates. And so I'm always fascinated with how smaller immigrant groups who are going to really be carrying the weight of population expansion over the very next several decades, how they are grappling with issues of democracy. And maybe it's selfish because at the Center for Law and Social Justice, we focus a lot on immigrant groups from the Pan-African diaspora. So I'm like, how do we take the good things that are happening other places and sort of mimic and replicate them here? I'm also curious about the impact going forward on what a report like this tells those of us who are fighting for the passage at the federal level of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I know you are likely aware that we have a state level John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act in the state of New York, which we are thrilled about. I think it's phenomenal, although I am very concerned with this current attack on any piece of legislation that's designed to help non-white people. I know it's already in the crosshairs. You and I, but look, I see you smiling. You and I both know that there are lawsuits already being planned to undermine that. But I'm wondering if this report gives us any insight into how we can fight for the reauthorization of a Voting Rights Act, a strengthened Voting Rights Act at the federal level, in light of the data that we now have as to the harmful impacts that decision is having in the real world of voters.
Yeah, I mean, my fervent hope for the report is that it proves that, we shouldn't have to prove it. We shouldn't have to prove that pre-clearance worked. Not everybody, a lot of people knew that it worked. I think maybe everybody knew, even if they, we'll leave that for another conversation. But we knew that it worked. But I think that, and I hope that this report provides a huge amount of support for all of us in the movement pushing for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that would restore that pre-clearance condition. I think it makes it a little bit harder for some people to stick their heads in the sand and say, we don't think that race discrimination in voting is a problem anymore. I think it really, there, as someone who sits behind a computer all day and writes and is a pointy-headed academic, I take a lot of hope and optimism from the groups on the ground doing this work. And one of the most gratifying things that we've heard after that was released was groups on the ground saying, thank you for proving what we knew. We knew it. We didn't need you to tell us, but now we've got it's got the fancy Dr. Morris says kind of thing behind it.
Right.
So hopefully it gives a little bit more of the pointy-headed academic support for something that fantastic groups on the ground have known and been fighting for the last 11 years at this point.
Yeah, yeah. Now you said, if I heard you correctly, that this data set goes back 16 years. Was that accurate? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah. We started in 2008. Is
I
the
was gonna
earliest.
say that feels like circa Obama era reality. What was it about that particular period that you used as a starting point, as say opposed to 2013 when the Shelby County decision came down?
Yeah, so there's kind of two things going on there. One is that these data don't exist before 2008. There was a federal bill that was passed, the Help America Vote Act, that was passed in the aftermath of kind of all the stuff that came out of the 2000 election in Florida, that required states to start collecting voter registration lists and making them publicly available. And so it's not until 2008 that we get really good nationwide data on registered voters everywhere. So that's kind of the earliest that we could do. One of the ways from the social science perspective that we can establish or infer that there was probably a causal relationship between Shelby County and the turnout gap is that we kind of look and see what was going on in the formerly covered places and not formerly covered places before Shelby County. And we can see, they were actually moving together. They were moving together before the Supreme Court decision. And it's only after Shelby County that this gap really starts to open up. So by leveraging some data from before the decision was handed down, we can actually get a better handle on what maybe the causal impacts were of the Supreme Court decision.
Okay. And you also mentioned that you didn't use polls or surveys, used actual voter file data. For people who are new to the concept of how we use data in the voting rights community, why rely on the voter file as opposed to, say, polls or surveys, or, there's the Marist poll, there's the Tide, there's all these different polls out. What was it about the data set that you use that makes it inherently more reliable than, say, exit polls or surveys that people fill out either before or after an election?
Yeah, there are kind of two big ways where this data really helps us kind of do a lot more than we can with the surveys. First is just the size of it. The size of it is that, some of these surveys are very big that you were talking about. Some of these polls are very big. They might have 50, 60, 100,000 people in them in any given year. We've got pretty much every voter that cast a ballot in any federal election between 2008 and 2022. So we've got almost very nearly 1 billion different records, which just kind of from a sample size blows the surveys out of the water. It let us get really low level estimates too. So some of these polls don't do a great job of representing even, small counties in West Texas or small counties in Georgia. Right. We just got every voter that voted in any of those counties. So we can really do very low level analyses. And then the second side is that on polls, sometimes folks will misrepresent whether or not they voted. Especially, we know that certain groups have really strong pressures within their community to vote. So even if they didn't vote, they know they're supposed to say that they did. And so people will sometimes say, oh yeah, of course I voted. I always vote. I vote every year. So yeah, I voted last year. And that can kind of skew our estimates of turnout. Because people know what they're supposed to tell the person taking the survey.
I mean, I guess I'm glad that people feel a sense of shame about not voting when they should. But yeah, I really like not only looking at the information that a study produces, but understanding where the data came from so that people have more confidence in the outcomes or in the findings of the study, and so that people recognize, because one of the things we say frequently on the shows on this channel is that polls are for strippers and we should leave them there. And that is a good thing, because that is a tool that they use for their work environment. No shade, no harm. We appreciate it. A good tool in its proper place, but we do not not use polls to base our political understanding on, particularly because when it comes to our community, Dr. Morris, they're fundamentally usually flawed, and we often get a different outcome when you're actually polling Black people than when you're polling a sample of people who also include a few Black people. So we have a little bit of, I don't want to say distrust of polls, not at all, but we like to get accurate data.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
break it down where the accuracy comes from is really important. Anything else we need to know about this report, this study? Obviously I live in a state of perpetual concern when it comes to voter turnout. That's just, I guess that's what I'm paid to do. Is there any other highline points that we should be aware of from this study, or action points that we can take now that we're aware of the findings?
Yeah, I mean, we were kind of laughing about this at the start, that it's pretty, there are a lot of pessimistic stories coming out of this report. One of the less pessimistic stories is that turnout is going up for all groups, right? It's going up more for white voters, and that's leading to a bigger gap. But we're living in an era of really high civic engagement, and we should celebrate that, and we should work with our communities to make sure that everybody that wants to vote this fall can. So we should celebrate that, and also get to work to make sure that these gaps are closing. And then we discussed this kind of at length before, but the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We need to put pressure on Congress now so that if there's a pro-democracy trifecta next year, we can get that over the finish line and get back to work rebuilding the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah. Look at you getting me optimistic. How about that? I didn't expect that at the end of this
That's
conversation.
the first time I've heard that in a while.
Especially out of a report like this, but we got to take our joy where we can find it. He is Dr. Kevin Morris with the Brennan Center. Kevin, what's the best way for our followers, for our listeners to connect with the Brennan Center, to follow you guys, and get access to the same data that many of the institutions throughout the city of New York and, quite frankly, the country are relying on to help structure our voting rights efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. Go to BrennanCenter.org is our website. We're on Twitter, we're on Blue Sky, we're on Instagram, everywhere with the same handle. So be sure to follow us if you want to support our work. No one's gonna say no to that.
That's right.
But if you just engage with the work and share it, that's good enough. So we appreciate everyone's kind of engagement with these topics.